The wind howled through the Palo Duro Canyon, carrying the unmistakable sound of thundering hooves. Abigail clutched her shivering children, her back against the unforgiving sandstone. A lone, heavily armed rider emerged from the dust. "Take my children!" she screamed, bracing for death. The stranger stopped. "You're all coming with me." The Texas sun in the summer of 1881 was not merely hot. It was a physical weight, a hammer striking the anvil of the earth. Abigail Preston tasted blood and alkaline dust on her cracked lips as she dragged herself up the rocky incline. Her boots, worn thin from 3 days of relentless walking, offered little protection against the jagged limestone of the hill country. Behind her, her 8-year-old son, Samuel, stumbled, his small hand gripping the collar of his 5-year-old sister, Lily. "Keep moving, Sammy," Abigail whispered, her voice a raspy ghost of its former self. "Just a little further up the ridge." They were running out of time, and they had already run out of water. Only a week ago, Abigail had a home. She had a husband, Thomas, and a modest but thriving cattle ranch near the settlement of Bandera. But Thomas had made the fatal mistake of defying Josiah Blackwood. Blackwood wasn't just a cattle baron. He was a ruthless syndicate man backed by Eastern money, buying up water rights and bleeding the independent ranchers dry. When Thomas refused to sell the deed to the clear-running creek that bisected their property, Blackwood didn't send lawyers. He sent Elias Bones Harrison and a posse of hired guns. Abigail still saw the flashes of gunfire every time she closed her eyes. She still smelled the burning pine of their farmhouse. Thomas had held them off just long enough for Abigail to load the children onto their roan mare and flee into the night. The mare had given out on the second day, taken a bad step in a prairie dog hole and breaking her leg. Abigail had to leave her behind, armed only with her husband's heavy Colt revolver and a paralyzing fear. Now, they were being hunted. Blackwood couldn't risk leaving witnesses, especially a widow who held the legal deed he so desperately needed to forge. Harrison and his trackers were closing in. Abigail could see the dust plumes rising in the valley below, a relentless storm of violence tracking their every step. Lily let out a soft whimper, her little legs giving out. She collapsed into the scrub brush, her face flushed with fever. "Mama, I can't," she cried, her voice barely a squeak. Abigail dropped to her knees, scooping the child into her arms. Despair, cold and absolute, finally shattered the dam of her resolve. She looked at Samuel, who was trying so hard to be brave, his dirt-streaked face hardened in a way no child should ever be. They were trapped in a box canyon, the towering walls of Palo Duro offering no escape route. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, no longer a distant threat, but an imminent reality. They would be here in minutes. Abigail frantically scanned the area, looking for a crevice, a cave, anything. That was when she smelled it. Wood smoke. It was faint, masked by the scent of dry sage and dust, but it was there. She forced herself to her feet carrying Lily and gestured for Samuel to follow. They rounded a massive boulder, the canyon wall widening slightly into a small shaded alcove. There, sitting beside a meager, smokeless fire built from dry buffalo chips, was a man. He was carving a piece of jerky with a hunting knife, his movements slow and deliberate. He wore a dusty, faded canvas duster, and a weathered Stetson was pulled low over his eyes. Beside him rested a Winchester rifle, and a modified Colt Peacemaker was tied low on his thigh. A massive, muscular draft-cross horse and a heavily laden pack mule stood quietly in the shadows behind him. He didn't jump when Abigail burst into his camp. He merely stopped carving, his ice-blue eyes lifting to meet her terrified gaze. He looked like a man who had seen the devil and offered him a light, hardened, quiet, and incredibly dangerous. "Please," Abigail gasped, falling to her knees at the edge of his camp. The heavy Colt she carried slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The stranger looked at the gun, then at the exhausted woman, and finally at the two children. He didn't say a word. He just slowly sheathed his knife. The sound of horses whinnying echoed off the canyon walls. They were at the mouth of the draw. Harrison's men had found them. Panic seized Abigail's heart. She looked at the stranger's sturdy horse, then at the man himself. He was a hardened drifter, maybe an outlaw himself, but he was heavily armed. He was their only chance. She pushed Samuel forward, shoving the boy toward the stranger, and thrust Lily toward him as well. "Take them!" Abigail screamed, her voice cracking with absolute raw desperation. Tears cut clean trails through the dirt on her cheeks. "Take my children. Ride out the back way. I'll stay. I have my husband's gun. I can hold them off. Just get my babies to Abilene. My cousin Sarah is there, Sarah Higgins. She'll pay you. Just take my children." She turned her back to the man, picking up her dropped revolver, her hands shaking violently as she aimed it toward the canyon entrance. She was ready to die. She was ready to be torn apart by Harrison's bullets if it bought her children even 10 minutes of a head start. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds, broken only by the approaching clatter of iron horseshoes on rock. Then she heard the metallic clack, clack of a Winchester lever being racked. A large, calloused hand gently pushed the barrel of her trembling revolver down. Abigail gasped, spinning around. The stranger was standing right beside her, towering over her. Up close, she saw a jagged scar running down the left side of his jaw, a brutal reminder of a violent past. Yet his eyes weren't cruel. They were utterly calm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "That ain't a mother's job to die alone in the dirt." He reached out, effortlessly picking up Samuel by the back of his suspenders and setting him onto the saddle of his massive horse. He gently took Lily from Abigail's frozen arms and settled her securely in front of the boy. Abigail stared at him, bewildered. "What are you doing? There isn't room." The cowboy grabbed Abigail by the waist and practically hoisted her up behind the saddle, right behind her son. "Take my children," she had cried. The cowboy swung himself up onto the saddle, settling right in front of Lily, effectively shielding the whole family with his broad back. He pulled his Winchester rifle tight against his chest and grabbed the reins. "You're all coming with me," he said. The name was Silas McCoy. Once a captain in the Texas Rangers out of Company D, he had spent the years since the war drifting, trying to outrun the ghosts of men he'd put in the ground. He had ridden into the Palo Duro looking for solitude, a place where the world couldn't find him. Instead, the world had quite literally dropped into his lap in the form of a terrified widow and her 2 children. "Hold on tight, ma'am," Silas ordered, his voice cutting through Abigail's shock. He didn't spur the massive draft horse, whom he called Goliath. Instead, he whistled a sharp, piercing note. The pack mule fell into step beside them. Silas guided Goliath not toward the canyon mouth where the riders were entering, but straight toward what looked like a solid rock wall at the back of the alcove. "There's nowhere to go," Abigail cried out, peering over his shoulder. "Just hold on to your boy," Silas replied calmly. As they closed the distance, the shadows shifted, revealing a narrow, jagged fissure in the sandstone, a dry wash that had been carved by centuries of flash floods. It was barely wide enough for the horse to squeeze through. Silas spurred Goliath forward. The heavy horse surged into the gap just as a shout echoed from the main canyon. "There, by the dead fire," a voice bellowed. It was Bones Harrison. "They're in the cut. Flush 'em out." Gunfire erupted. A bullet chipped the sandstone just inches from Abigail's head, raining sharp rock dust over them. She screamed, burying her face into Samuel's back, shielding him as best she could. Silas didn't flinch. He twisted in the saddle, brought the Winchester up with one hand, and fired 3 rapid shots back through the narrow opening. He wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming at the rock walls directly above the canyon entrance. The heavy .44-40 rounds shattered the fragile, overhanging sandstone. With a deafening crack, a shower of heavy boulders and loose scree collapsed downward, partially blocking the entrance to the fissure and kicking up a blinding cloud of dust. "That'll buy us 10 minutes," Silas muttered, turning back around and urging Goliath up the steep, treacherous incline of the dry wash. "They'll have to leave their horses and climb over on foot." They rode in tense silence for what felt like hours. The sun began to dip below the canyon rim, casting long, bloody shadows across the desolate landscape. Silas navigated the labyrinthine canyons with the instincts of a man who had hunted and been hunted in these badlands before. Goliath never faltered, the immense power of the horse carrying the weight of 4 people with surprising grace. Abigail clung to the back of the saddle, her body trembling from the adrenaline crash. She watched the broad, steady back of the stranger. He was an absolute mystery. He hadn't asked for money. He hadn't asked for favors. He had simply stepped between her and certain death. When darkness finally blanketed the plains, Silas brought Goliath to a halt in a dense grove of cottonwood trees near a trickling, muddy spring. It was concealed from the high ridges, a perfect place to vanish. He dismounted smoothly and reached up to help them down. He took Lily first. The little girl was asleep, her fever having broken slightly in the cool night air. He handed her gently to Abigail, his calloused hands surprisingly tender. "Drink," Silas said, unhooking a large leather canteen from his saddle and offering it to her. Abigail took it, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She drank greedily, the warm, metallic water tasting like the finest wine she had ever had. She passed it to Samuel, who gulped it down. "Thank you," Abigail whispered, finding her voice as she sank to the base of a cottonwood, holding her sleeping daughter. I don't even know your name." "McCoy," he said shortly. "Silas McCoy." He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he immediately went to work. He stripped the saddle from Goliath, wiped the massive beast down with a handful of dry grass, and checked the mule's pack. He didn't build a fire. Light would attract Harrison's men like moths to a flame. He pulled 2 heavy wool blankets from his pack and tossed them to Abigail. "Wrap the kids up. Night air in the panhandle gets bone-chilling." Abigail wrapped Samuel and Lily, watching Silas as he took a seat on a nearby rock, his Winchester resting across his knees. He pulled a small whetstone from his pocket and began running it along the edge of his hunting knife in the dark. Sato, sato, sati. The rhythmic sound was oddly comforting. "Why did you do it?" Abigail asked, the silence of the night pressing in on them. "You could have ridden away. You don't owe us anything. Josiah Blackwood is a powerful man in Fort Worth. If his men find you with us, they'll kill you just as quickly." Silas stopped sharpening the knife. He looked up at the stars, his scarred face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "A long time ago, Mrs. Preston," Silas said, his voice quiet. I saw men do terrible things for pieces of paper and patches of dirt. I stood by because I thought the law would sort it out. The law didn't. He looked back down at her, his blue eyes intense in the shadows. I made a promise to myself after the war. I don't stand by anymore, and I don't leave women and children to the wolves. Abigail felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time since Thomas had died, she felt a microscopic sliver of hope. They won't stop hunting us, Mr. McCoy. Blackwood needs my signature on the deed to the property in Bandera. He needs me alive, but he doesn't care about my children. That's why I wanted you to take them. Your cousin in Abilene, Silas said, changing the subject. She reliable? Yes, Abigail nodded. Her husband is a deputy there. If we can reach them, Blackwood's men won't dare try anything in Judge Parker's extended jurisdiction. Abilene is a hard ride. 10 days, maybe 12 if we have to stick to the draws to avoid being spotted. Silas stood up, sliding the knife back into its sheath. Get some sleep, ma'am. We ride out 2 hours before dawn. Harrison is a bloodhound. He'll figure out we doubled back toward the Salt Fork by midday tomorrow. Abigail lay down on the hard earth, pulling Samuel close to her side. She watched Silas as he took up the first watch, sitting perfectly still against the trunk of a tree, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. He was a terrifying man, a man bred for violence. Yet, as Abigail closed her eyes, she realized that in this brutal, lawless land, a monster was exactly what she needed to protect her angels. But as the wind picked up, howling through the cottonwoods, Abigail knew the real test was yet to come. Blackwood's men were ruthless, and the unforgiving Texas plains had a way of breaking even the strongest of men. They were alive tonight, but tomorrow the hunt would begin again. The journey across the sun-baked expanse of the Texas Panhandle was a crucible that forged them into something more than strangers. For 6 days, they moved like phantoms through the mesquite and chaparral, avoiding the established cattle trails. The heat was a living, breathing adversary, but Silas McCoy proved to be a master of the unforgiving terrain. He knew which prickly pear cacti held the most moisture, how to find shade where none seemingly existed, and how to keep Goliath and the pack mule moving without breaking them down. More importantly, he knew how to keep Samuel and Lily calm. Abigail watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and an unfamiliar warming flutter in her chest. This hardened drift rider, a man who slept with a hand on his Winchester and moved with the silent, coiled tension of a rattlesnake, was endlessly patient with her children. On the 4th night, while camped in a dry ravine near the Double Mountain Fork, Abigail watched as Silas sat by the dim glow of a hooded lantern. He was guiding Samuel's small hands, teaching the boy how to properly whittle a piece of soft cedar without cutting his fingers. Lily was asleep, her head resting comfortably against Silas's heavy canvas duster, which he had folded into a makeshift pillow. Abigail sat across from them, mending a tear in Samuel's shirt. She looked at Silas, truly studying the harsh lines of his face, the jagged scar, the permanent squint of a man used to staring down the sun and his enemies alike. "You're good with them," Abigail said softly, her voice barely carrying over the chirp of the cicadas. Silas didn't look up from the cedar carving. "Children ain't got no business carrying the weight of the world, Mrs. Preston. A boy should know how to carve a wooden horse before he has to learn how to shoot a real man." "You can call me Abigail," she murmured. Silas paused, his ice-blue eyes lifting to meet hers in the flickering lantern light. There was a profound, unspoken understanding passing between them. a shared recognition of the harshness of the world, and a quiet gratitude for the solace they had found in each other's company. Abigail. He repeated, the name sounding strangely gentle, rolling off his gravelly voice. But the frontier does not allow peace to linger. On the afternoon of the 7th day, they reached a treacherous, muddy crossing of the Brazos River. The water was low, but the banks were steep and choked with dense willow thickets. It was a natural choke point, and Silas knew it. He dismounted, signaling for Abigail to stay atop Goliath with the children, concealed behind a cluster of massive boulders. Silas drew his Winchester, his eyes scanning the opposite bank. The wind shifted, blowing from the east. Silas flared his nostrils. "Tobacco," he whispered, a lethal calm washing over his face. "Cheap Burley." Before he could shout a warning, the deafening roar of a Sharps Point 50-90 Buffalo rifle shattered the afternoon silence. The heavy slug slammed into the boulder inches from Abigail's leg, showering them in sharp rock splinters. Goliath reared, terrified, but Abigail clamped her legs tight against the saddle horn, desperately grabbing Lily and Samuel to keep them from falling. "Get down, into the wash," Silas roared, sprinting back toward the horse. Gunfire erupted from the willow thickets across the river. It wasn't just a tracking party, it was an ambush. Elias, Bones, Harrison had anticipated their route, riding his men hard to beat them to the crossing. Bullets whipped through the air, snapping branches and kicking up plumes of red Texas mud. Silas grabbed Goliath's bridle, physically dragging the massive horse down into the muddy depression of the river bank, out of the direct line of fire. He shoved Abigail and the children behind the thick, rotting trunk of a fallen cottonwood tree. "Keep your heads down and cover their ears," Silas barked. He didn't wait for her response. He vaulted over the cottonwood log, dropping to one knee in the mud, and brought the Winchester to his shoulder. He fired with terrifying speed and precision. Crack, lever, crack, lever, crack. He wasn't shooting blindly. He was aiming at the muzzle flashes in the brush. A scream echoed over the water as one of Harrison's men took a .44-40 round to the shoulder and tumbled down the riverbank into the muddy shallows. "Fan out," Harrison's voice bellowed from the brush. "Pin the bastard down. The woman is mine." Silas shifted his position to get a better angle on the flanking riders, exposing his left side for just a fraction of a second. It was all Harrison needed. A shot rang out from a different angle. Silas grunted, a sharp, guttural sound, and fell backward into the mud. "Silas!" Abigail screamed. She scrambled toward him, her heart dropping into her stomach. He was clutching his left side, blood already seeping rapidly through his fingers and turning his canvas duster a dark, shiny crimson. The bullet had caught him just above the hip, a clean through and through, but he was losing blood fast. He gritted his teeth, his face paling, but he stubbornly hoisted his rifle with his right hand. "I'm fine. Stay back." But he couldn't rack the lever with one hand. Two of Harrison's men, sensing the pause and returning fire, broke from the willows and began splashing across the shallow river, their revolvers drawn, moving in for the kill. Abigail looked at Silas, bleeding in the mud, then at her terrified children huddled behind the log. The despair that had paralyzed her in the canyon a week ago was gone, incinerated by a sudden, protective fury. "Take my children," she had cried. "No," she thought now, "nobody takes my family." She lunged toward Silas's dropped saddlebags and retrieved Thomas's heavy Colt revolver. She didn't hesitate. She stepped over the fallen cottonwood, squaring her shoulders against the approaching men. She cocked the heavy hammer back with both thumbs, leveled the barrel, and fired. The recoil bruised her palm, but the shot was true. The lead deputy, a syndicate gun thug known as Dutch Henry, took the bullet squarely in the thigh. He screamed, dropping his gun and collapsing into the muddy water. The second man, shocked by the sudden resistance from the widow, hesitated. That hesitation was all Silas needed. Fighting through the agonizing pain, he drew his peacemaker from his thigh holster with his right hand and fired twice. The second man went down. Silence descended on the river crossing, save for the groans of the wounded men in the water. Harrison, realizing his advantage was gone and his men were bleeding out, shouted a curse from the thicket. The sound of retreating hoofbeats echoed into the distance. They had survived, but the cost was high. Abigail dropped the gun and fell to her knees beside Silas. She ripped the hem of her petticoat, her hands flying as she packed the wound to staunch the bleeding. Silas looked up at her, his breathing shallow, a weak, admiring smile touching the corners of his pale lips. "I reckon," Silas gasped, wincing as she tied the makeshift bandage tight. "You don't need me to do the shooting for you after all, Abigail." "Shut up and save your strength, McCoy," she said, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line through the dirt on her cheek. "You promised to get us to Abilene. I intend to hold you to that." The booming new railroad town of Abilene, Texas, was a chaotic mess of canvas tents, freshly cut lumber, and driving ambition when they finally rode in 4 days later. The Texas and Pacific Railway had just laid the tracks, and the town was a hive of cattlemen, gamblers, and desperate souls. Silas was burning with a severe fever. He was slumped forward in the saddle, barely conscious, kept upright only by a rope Abigail had lashed around his waist and the saddle horn. Abigail walked ahead, leading Goliath by the reins, her face set in a mask of grim determination. Samuel and Lily rode the pack mule, exhausted but silent. They navigated the muddy, rutted streets, ignoring the stares of the townsfolk, until they reached Elm Street. There, just as she remembered from the letters, stood a sturdy 2-story clapboard building with the sign that read, "Higgins Boarding House, clean beds, hot meals." Abigail tied the horses to the hitching post and practically carried Silas through the front door, shouting for her cousin. "Sarah, Sarah, please." But the woman who stepped out of the parlor was not Sarah Higgins. It was a hired gun, holding a double-barreled shotgun leveled right at Abigail's chest. "Come on in, Mrs. Preston," a smooth, cultured voice called out from the parlor. "We've been expecting you." Abigail's blood ran cold. She stepped slowly into the parlor, supporting the heavy, feverish weight of Silas against her shoulder. Sitting in a plush velvet armchair, sipping tea from a delicate china cup, was Josiah Blackwood. He wore a pristine Eastern suit, looking entirely out of place in the dusty frontier town, yet exuding absolute, ruthless control. Sarah Higgins was tied to a chair in the corner, a gag in her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Bones, Harrison, stood by the fireplace, his arm in a sling from the river fight, glaring at Silas with pure hatred. "You're a difficult woman to track down, Abigail," Blackwood said, setting his teacup down with a delicate clink. "You've caused me a great deal of expense, and you've ruined some perfectly good hired help." He gestured dismissively toward Silas. "Drop the drifter. He's dead anyway. Sign the deed to the Bandera property, and I'll consider letting your children live." Abigail felt the room spinning. They had survived the desert, survived the ambush, only to walk directly into the lion's den. She had no leverage, she had nothing left. Suddenly, the weight leaning against her shifted. Silas McCoy, eyes glassy with fever and his shirt soaked in dried blood, straightened up. He pushed himself off Abigail's shoulder. His movements were slow, agonizing, but fueled by a sheer, terrifying force of will. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood between Abigail and Blackwood, his towering frame shielding the family once more. "You ain't getting a signature, Blackwood," Silas rasped, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And you ain't touching this family." "Bones," Harrison scoffed, reaching for his revolver with his good hand. "You're a dead man standing, McCoy. What are you gonna do?" "He's not gonna do anything," a booming, authoritative voice echoed from the boarding house doorway. "But I certainly will." Everyone froze. Standing in the doorway was a massive, broad-shouldered man wearing a heavy black coat, a pristine white Stetson, and a gleaming silver star pinned to his chest. He held a Winchester rifle aimed squarely at Blackwood's chest. Behind him stood 3 armed deputies, blocking the exits. It was Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. Blackwood's arrogant sneer faltered for the first time. "Marshal Reeves, you have no jurisdiction here. This is a local property dispute. Crossing state lines to hire syndicate killers, tampering with the U.S. mail to intercept Mrs. Preston's letters, and murdering a landowner," Reeves said, his voice like rolling thunder. "That makes it federal business, Mr. Blackwood. I've been tracking your syndicate's bloody trail from Fort Smith down to the Brazos. Sarah Higgins wired my office before you got your hands on her." Reeves stepped into the room, his presence completely dominating the space. "Josiah Blackwood, Elias Harrison, you are under arrest by the authority of the United States government." Harrison panicked. He drew his revolver, aiming blindly at the marshal. Before Harrison could even cock the hammer, Silas, moving with instincts that transcended his fever, drew his peacemaker and fired a single shot. The gun blasted the revolver right out of Harrison's hand, shattering the man's wrist. Reeves's deputies swarmed the room, disarming Blackwood's stunned guards and violently throwing Harrison to the floor. Blackwood slowly raised his hands, his face pale, realizing his reign of terror was finally over. Reeves looked at the smoking gun in Silas's hand, then at the bloody bandage around his waist. The legendary lawman gave a slow, respectful nod. "Put the gun away, son. You've done enough. The law has it from here." Silas stared at the marshal for a long moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, he smoothly decocked the peacemaker and slid it into his holster. His strength finally gave out, and he collapsed backward. Abigail caught him before he hit the floor, her arms wrapping tightly around him. She looked up at Marshal Reeves, tears of profound relief streaming down her face, pulling Samuel and Lily close against her side. The nightmare was over. The hunt was finished. The dust of Abilene finally settled, carrying away the dark ghosts of Abigail's past. Josiah Blackwood hung for his ruthless crimes. Silas McCoy never rode away. He traded his wandering saddle for a porch chair on their new ranch, raising Samuel and Lily as his own blood. Out of desperate terror grew a fiercely loyal family, proving that in the unforgiven wild frontiers, true love remains the most formidable force.